Welcome to Disambiguation. I'm your host, Michael Fauscette. Each week, we interview experts in artificial intelligence, generative AI, and business automation to help business leaders understand how to use these tools for the biggest business impact. In our show today, we're going to take a look at crafting an effective AI strategy. I'm excited to be joined by Michael Peter, Principal Architect, Google Cloud. Mike, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Why don't we start by just doing a quick introduction? Tell us a little bit about your background and what you do at Google.
Sure. So at Google, like you said, I'm a principal architect. I work primarily on strategic pursuits. So disrupt their industry, figure out how they're going to basically leapfrog everyone else in their vertical. And they need assistance with both like the business strategy and the technical strategy on how to do that. So I'm part of the team that goes in and says, if you're ready to, kind of take things to the next level, become the Google of whatever your industry is, let's figure out what that looks like and how we start to make that a practical reality.
Yeah, that makes sense. So as a principal architect at Google Cloud, and I'm sure that you guys have seen a lot of evolution through proof of concept, experimental AI projects to all the way through deployment, right? So what do you think the biggest shifts are that you've seen from businesses, organizations that approach AI strategy, say last year and this year, and what distinguishes successful over where people struggle?
Yep. And I'll speak from the perspective of the customers that I work with, which is different from how Google handles it. And then part of what we do when we go in is help them understand how Google would handle it. But most of the shift over the last year has been less of, let's figure out what model to use, or let's figure out what the best model is for our use case, or what can it do? And let's try to experiment talking to our data, some data set, usually a small data set. And it's more about, okay, now that this thing looks like it's real, all of the news cycles are saying it's real. Our competitors, often look like they're ahead of us. If I'm taking the customer's role, how do we then leverage AI to build a competitive moat? Like, how do we win? How do we do things that are at least parity with what other folks are doing and going beyond where they can? And that's really important because certain parts of the technology are changing so fast that the company's adoption curve has to match that change. So it's less about focusing on a single experiment now and then quickly trying to ramp up the capability to evaluate, adopt, and build actual competitive solutions and products.
It seems like it shifted then to more kind of a bigger picture, complete view. Because I know, like over the last couple of years, when I talk to end user organizations that are thinking about doing these things, the conversation often either went to the technology or to the use case, but rarely to the outcome. And to me, that's backwards.
It is, and because there's such like a degree of hyperbole in the news cycle, or at least extremism in the news cycle, people are focusing on that element. And I'll say, like, there's a large number of companies that still do that, right? The program I work on is very select. So we only handle a few customers a year who are ready to take that steps. There are still plenty of customers who are focusing on the technology, and they come and say, well, okay, show us why Gemini is best. And that immediately puts them into a different level. Like, okay, you're still trying to get your arms around the technology, and a foundational sea change in the way that customers and companies need to move forward, even bigger than what happened with the internet. And that means there's a significant shift in strategy that needs to occur.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I like I said, I think that outcome focus that I've started to see more and more, and more talking about it from a strategy versus a tactic. I think that's a good move. But I'm curious now, if you think about, many companies are now kind of moving from prototypes and proof of concepts into production, and that's obviously an important milestone, even if it's in a limited deployment, right? But what kind of decisions are you seeing? What architectural decisions, infrastructure, those kinds of things as they make this transition, and then where do they mess up? Where are problems?
Yeah, and that's a great question, because this is the key concern for companies now with AI. Many have already done a number of experiments and figured out that there's a there. And where some of them lean in is continuing to treat something that needs to run into production as an isolated prototype, right? I have an assistant now. It can talk to my SharePoint. It can talk to my OneDrive. It can talk to my Google Drive. That's not an enterprise level solution. That's just something that may help your employees. How do you then, what you just spoke about, how does it achieve a strategic outcome? And that is where you need to think that's not just the model, and that's not just the use case. It's how do you get all intelligence platform and how it fits in with the existing applications that you have and the existing business that you have. And that is an architecture level reinvention of an organization. And that's what some companies are starting to get their arms around is this isn't something that you buy, that you pull into the system. This is a wholesale sort of reapproach to the fundamentals of doing business. How do you identify what the future state of a company is going to look like? You know, I used to say 5 years down the road, but now technology is moving so fast, it's 2 years down the road, or sooner.
Yeah.
What does your future you look like from a capability perspective? And then what's your first step today to make sure that you get there? And stop thinking about, I'm going to run a POC with a model, because anything, and I'll say this is from the perspective of what Google does internally, anything that you would like to do with AI and maybe currently think that it can't do, it can likely already do, because Google's been doing it with customers for the past 18 months.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, when you're when you're looking at the redesign from an infrastructure perspective, I mean, obviously, data is one of the biggest challenges for a lot of companies. Data quality, data access, finding data, I mean, like all those things, right? But what
Data
about,
readiness.
I mean, yeah, exactly. And automation that we need to put in place. I mean, a lot of stuff there, right? But what kind of architectural principles or do you think are most important for the transformation, and how do you help them look at their current situation from an architecture perspective and then, understand if it's AI ready?
Yeah, so the biggest gotcha for companies right now is that big data story. Sort of coherent data strategy is how do you take a slice of that strategy that actually delivers value and helps you build a foundation going forward, and you incrementally deliver slices of the cake instead of a layer at a time. But they do need to go back and revisit their big data story, and often that's not in good shape. So there's that, how do you get ready for access to data? Number one, from a Google perspective, store all of your data. I'm working with a company right now who basically they say we hold our data for 3 years and then it's gone. Okay. So then you have 3 years worth of knowledge that you can leverage versus 21 years of knowledge that you can leverage. And if you're building any sort of model, machine learning, LLM or otherwise, that's a huge, that's an order of magnitude difference, right, between those three. So number one is data storage is cheap. Store all your data until it's been proven not useful. And then make sure that you have an access pattern for live data, because part of the thing that you're going to build is based on, there's like a trough of, an emergent situation piece of data. You need to act on that data, like a customer call or a transaction or something like that. You have to act on it right then, which means a model or other AI that recognizes that thing. That model has to be trained on that massive backlog of data that you already have, but it needs to have access to data that's coming in from a real-time perspective. So they need those two approaches. How do we pull together all of our data across all this disparate systems, and then how do we push intelligence out to the edge that's able to access our live data? There's a whole pipeline of how do we architect ourselves so that any sort of change in technology in the AI space is pluggable into the processes that we're implementing from a future state perspective. Maybe I'm using Gemini, maybe I'm using Gemma, maybe I'm using Claude. The ultimate, to the integration on a specific business case or technical case that I'm solving, that process shouldn't care. And I should be able to plug it in seamlessly and plug it out seamlessly without impacting any of that continuous operation. Right.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was talking to a vendor earlier today, actually. And one of the things that they had just launched a product, and I was reading through the announcements, and one of the things that kind of got me excited was this an idea they came up with. They're calling a diamond record, a diamond customer record, instead of the gold record we used to talk about. What does it look like in the age of AI? And they've added agents and some things that would help you automate some of those processes. But the idea was really interesting, and it ties into some other things that I was working on. That they built a data record that combines the real-time data with all the transactional structured data and continues to add that real-time data so that you can use that in things like like a dynamic journey map or something like that. So
That's right.
I think
Yep.
that's really interesting, and companies don't think about the value of how much real-time data is going to be. And it's hard. It's much harder than what we're used to.
It's different. I wouldn't say it's necessarily hard, but it's definitely different. I think that, like, to your point, the hardest thing is how
Okay.
do you wrap your mind around how you would incorporate that into your business process, because that is not the old time enterprise architecture, right? You don't consider that sort of thing.
Mhm.
So it's a brand new mental model for folks, and then they have to figure out what the implementation pattern that looks like. Another one
Yeah.
that's just like that is the concept of the knowledge graph, right? Google has had a knowledge graph behind Google search since 2012. When I've been at Google for 6 years, and once I got up to speed, for 4 years we've been saying you have a ton of enterprise data, you have a ton of relational data. The real power of how you operate your business is in a graph that represents your ecosystem, your customers, your business operations, and that's where you're really going to start to extract real value. And there's probably about 3% of the customers who would tackle that. However,
Mhm.
to your point, any sort of diamond, customer profile or representation of the business as a business is going to rely on things like a knowledge graph in order
Mm.
to really optimize itself and really be able to achieve outcomes that aren't normal, to the point that is it Google recently? I just read a paper last week that, like, graph neural networks weren't around until 2015, and
Yeah.
now and so there was no machine learning, but you could still do cool things. I think recently, I think this year they're starting to train a graph-based LLM. So
Mm.
it's like a GLLM
That's
that
interesting.
knows and it knows how to operate on a graph, which is going to give you
Wow.
very different outcomes from a text-based,
Hmm.
probabilistic LLM.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I looked at last year. I looked at the idea of a graph rag, set up so that you could get to
Yep.
some of that graphic data. But this sounds like an even better way to approach this because your model itself is already trained
Yeah,
on that principle.
yeah, exactly. Right. And so it gets easier, right? So, like any production system, and we talked about this, one of the startups that I'm advising, Mamba, their core is graph
Mhm.
database, relational, and other sources. And you need to pull from all of that to fill in for what the other ones don't have. Not a slight plug for Google, but doing graphs is hard. Google's launched a set of things on top of BigQuery, which is its data lake solution that allows you to
Right.
create an ephemeral graph on top of flat relational data. So if
Hmm.
you have trouble with
Interesting.
graph management, now you can materialize a graph based on the specific relationships that you want to pursue, and that's directly from the key value proposition of a graph and the fact that managing a graph is so hard for enterprise customers.
Mm. Interesting, but very powerful if we can get to the point of that concept and really approaching things from a connected information perspective, right? So one of the things that I've seen and some of the conversations that I've been having lately have been centered around this idea of what does the new workforce look like, right? The digital workforce, human workforce, hybrid workforce. It's starting to have an impact on organizations, and I'm curious from what you've seen from an architectural perspective, should organizations prepare systems, data, infrastructure to support agentic or autonomous agents? And then how do they build governance into this so that they can build trust with that system?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start off with this. Their first step is to figure out how to augment their existing workforce to accelerate their current processes.
Mm.
And the reason why that is because there's a lot of, as they're learning how to do the agentic stuff, they need to understand where their bottlenecks are from their current processes. And that means giving their workers tools to automatically eliminate some of those areas where you have to swivel chair, you don't have access to data, or things like that. But you need a deeper dive on your current process and its execution flow to understand. Okay, we gave our workers a set of tools in this space. They're doing great. It may not be the best place to start from an agentic perspective because we're already seeing a higher, a hockey stick somewhere. So it helps you amplify the current workforce. It helps them get used to working with AI tools. They will then give you feedback about, now that I'm using this, I would actually love to get rid of this thing. And that thing may be an agent that not just retrieves data, but it does some reasoning about that data, so it delivers an outcome versus just delivering information. So that's basically maximizing the brain span of your organization from an organizational readiness perspective. And then the next piece of that.
Sorry,
go ahead.
No, go ahead. I was going to ask you another, but go ahead.
Yeah. So then the next piece of that is, okay, great. Now you start to understand, one, you get the practice of deploying tools like this, because first it forces you to build the AI service fabric with which you're pushing things out to your employees. It helps you build the security model, the governance model, explainability, and then how you're monitoring how these things are being used. And that prepares you for the fabric of, now I want to make something autonomous and push it into that same realm where I need monitoring, I need observability, I need understanding on the results that it's producing, which I've already all built because I'm looking at results from human use. And then sort of it's like the Kubernetes kind of approach. Where are all my deployments? How are they running? Are things healthy? Then you have to inject and introspect inside its actual operation to understand, is it staying on the rails? Is it off the rails? What's the interaction look like? Is it delivering value or not? All of that is a set of observability tools, and frankly, other LLMs that are watching or other agents that are watching agents perform to understand operationally what's happening. So it is, but the first part is, people need to have access to tools, both from I'm going to use these AI tools in my work, and also from I need to be able to watch and operate these AI tools from a technology perspective so that I understand what's going on.
Yeah, I think I sort of like to think of three questions when people ask me about agents and autonomy, right? It's what's the level of autonomy that you want to give the agent? How do you want humans involved? And third, how does it fail if it does? Because it will. Right.
Right.
So I sort of think around those three ideas, at least conceptually, and hopefully, and you talk about this a lot. It's a continuum of autonomy, and I think sometimes we get lost in that it's an AI agent or it's not. It's autonomous or it's not, and that's not really the way the world works, right? There's trust building over time. There's the ability to transparency and explainability. All those things come together to help the employee understand how they work with the digital worker.
That's right. Yep. How much can you take away their pain? And to your point, the trust building, because that gets them ready to adopt the next phase, right? You're elevating their work, you're reducing the amount of work that they want to do. Give me all the information so I can write a requirement. Okay, I'm tired of writing a requirement. Here's all the information, write the requirement, let me validate it. So you get them to that point, right, where the tedium becomes what they used to think was their day job, and they're much better at overseeing that process and making sure, to your point, doesn't go off the rails, and making sure that there's quality output.
Yeah, that to me that seems logical. I mean, we used to, when we implemented enterprise systems, always talk about some sort of a phased approach, and it depend on the organization how you do it. But I think thinking of this in the same way, like I'm phasing this into the eventual autonomy that I want, or maybe that'll even continue to evolve right over time as agents get more capable.
Exactly.
Yeah,
there is the fabric that you use to deploy an LLM to your internal employee base and to your customers is the same fabric that you use to start creating agents that assist people, is the same fabric that you use to create autonomous agents. Just make sure you do the learning as a company when it's easier and safer, and not necessarily jump straight into autonomy, because there is a lot of learning that's going to occur.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's not a race in that perspective, right? It may be a competitive race, but but from a worker perspective and a digital worker perspective, you've got to move the organization forward in steps, right? Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
So when we think about the about data, because obviously that's the foundation of all of this. For a while, we were really sure that everything was going to be in the cloud, right? We're going to get to a point pretty soon, everything's in the cloud. Cool. And then we sort of went the other way and said, well, I don't know, maybe that's not really it. But I guess what I started to see is there's kind of more hybrid and multi-cloud in organizations, especially larger organizations, than there is just a simple, I'm in a public cloud, I'm in a private cloud, whatever. So with that idea, how do you architect the AI solutions to operate across the diversity from the data source, and how do you get the right performance and security when you do that?
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. And that is the key point, right? Data is the engine of creation,
Yeah.
regardless of what type of AI you're using, right? Could be machine learning, could be an LLM, could be an OR type of model. And almost every enterprise that isn't like a digital native has a multi-cloud solution and plus an on-prem solution. So, to unlock these sorts of things, from a Google perspective, right, they have BigQuery. BigQuery is in the cloud, but BigQuery has connectors that allow it to run in other clouds on-prem to gather data, and bring it up to do, either analysis or model training or things like that. So from a
Yeah.
multi-cloud and on-prem perspective, it's not as straightforward as if you are just living cloud native in a particular cloud. However, there are solutions for that, right? So
Mm.
either having a solution that can reach into wherever the data happens to sit, or you can do things like federated learning, which is, for the folks who may not know what that is, that's, I want to train a machine learning model, but for, privacy reasons, security reasons, HIPAA reasons, can't bring the data all into one location. So what I do is I
Yeah.
push the model training down to the edge, the device of where it may
Mm.
happen to be, do the training there, and then push the weights, which are anonymized, back up to wherever the
Mm.
primary training pipeline happens to be. So that maintains security.
Mm.
Once I have that trained, then I need to be able to push the intelligence down to your phone, down to your watch, down to your on-prem data center, or down to your on-prem, data center resident device or another cloud, or to be able to run like a machine learning model, either a very small machine learning model, or LLM, like a billion parameter model, wherever it happens to be,
Yeah.
and be able to run it isolated. So those patterns are things that we're figuring out. All that is heavily dependent
Mm.
on the use case that the company is trying to solve, and those use cases should be delivering enough value that it justifies the effort and cost of implementing whatever that particular solution happens to be, right? But
Mm.
there's solutions for there are architectural patterns for all that. What the primary driver is, what's the value return on that architectural solution, and what's the follow-on pipeline of a value that follows that. How many use cases can follow? Is it a one-off, or is it 20 or 30 that live after that?
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned you mentioned BigQuery and you mentioned federated, so I kind of takes me to another place that I've started to see some, and I'm curious how Google thinks of this. And I've heard this used, bring the AI to the data versus moving the data to AI. So,
Yeah.
what from an architectural perspective, how do you recommend companies, organizations look at that to really get the value out of those distributed data assets?
If it's my approach, the strategic approach with customers, the primary
Hmm.
driver is what's the business outcome, and that business outcome has to be a 10x outcome. And the rough measure is,
Mm.
what is it going to cost to create this? And you can use a number, right? Whatever, like, if you have a development team, whatever their burn rate is from a time and money standpoint is for 4 to 6 months, the value
Mhm.
return on whatever they build should be at least 10 times that. And if it's not
Mhm.
that, that's the floor, right? If it's not that, then you've identified the wrong thing. Go find something that will deliver that.
Mm.
And I guarantee you will find it, right? You'll find stuff that
Mm.
is 10x, 20x, 50x, 100x. Like we can reliably, or when we have reliably helped companies find that kind of value chain. And once you have that, then architects can come in and say, here's how we get the data out of your data center, or we don't have to move it out of your data center because here's how we're going to push, for example, federated learning down there, or we're going to install Gemma in there, and there's going to be, basically message passing or event passing that is going to allow it to communicate with the digital plane or other, or other warehouses or other stores or other whatever the locations or sites happen to be.
Mm.
Yeah, the primary. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that resonates if I think about it from a how do I want to make sure I get the outcome I'm looking for, and at the same time I've got to figure out all those how to rationalize all the different data sources and methods across that.
That is,
yeah.
and you're right. That's the primary friction, right? The customer will say, we want to be able to do this. It relies on data that's locked up on-prem. Technical team says we can't move that data because we have data duplication, right? Which is expensive. It's not. Data storage is cheap. Right. Or we can unlock it for these different reasons. But if they say, I'll give you just sort of a constructed example. If they say, it's going to cost, I'm gonna give you a low number. If it's going to cost $100,000 to get this data and solution into place, there better be north of $1 million return on that. And if it's north of $1 million return or $10 million return.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's talk about privacy and security a little bit, because that's obviously always comes up in my conversations. And I know that's something that especially from an autonomous perspective makes people maybe a little nervous. But the other thing that I've heard and from my cybersecurity friends, they talk about defensive and offensive and how those kind of create this momentum or arms race, basically.
Yes.
To make sure you build those resilient systems. And so you're kind of flipping this and saying, I'm going to build, security by design, because that's critical to my deployment. I mean, how do you think about that? How do you help companies think about that?
It is an AI arms race, and security is kind of a leading edge of that, given that, you've seen some of the articles out there, how easy it is to times, spoof or hack an LLM into giving you its system prompt, or it's the same things that the guardrails are supposed to prevent. So there's definitely architectures that are designed to kind of prevent those sort of things from happening. But like the fundamental elements of that design is zero trust, right? Stuff that we've known for years, right? Validate all your inputs, zero trust of actors, secure your AI supply chain, not just the customer facing things, but as you're developing, your models, make sure you understand the lineage of everything that's going in to either train or tune it. Understand, this is the model, here's where it's being stored in your model registry. You deploy it into, where the specific production environment that it's going to live. You've locked down the access to that, to that actual endpoint, and not the firewall concept, but the actual endpoint in terms of authorization and authentication. And then you also then have the fleet of other models living around that are observing and watching its behavior, looking for threats, and then alerting as soon as possible. So it's sort of an existing security model, and then up-leveled for AI. It's sort of the same one that Google uses itself in threat detection, but all customers are going to have to think about evolving their cybersecurity, where these AI solutions and agents are part of and partner to that security model. And it's not just securing the production deployment of things, it's also part of the SDLC, the operations as well.
Right. So I get that with cybersecurity, particularly because I think, conceptually, it's really makes a lot of sense that I'm going to design this from the ground up to include all of these additional security measures that can help, secure the system, and it's by design. But does that work for privacy too? I mean, should companies really focus when they're laying this out from a strategy perspective, and then moving into how do I build this? Do I build privacy by design into this too? Is that the same sort of concept?
three elements, right? Security, privacy, and explainability are all
Mm,
core to the approach, and it works across the identification and development of the capability and the different capabilities that may be a part of the total solution, as well
mhm,
as the operation of that, of that in production. Right? That
mm,
that is a part of the architecture, the SDLC, and the production operations. Those three elements are very key.
mm,
When they come along with your tool set, that makes things much easier than having to build things by hand, because resiliency, scalability, production readiness, sort of sophistication from a tool can be greater than, I'm writing this, but it's the first time I ever wrote something like this. There's a lot of lessons that I'm going to encounter as I try to make this, as I'm trying to evolve this.
mm. So I know companies talk a lot about, and there's been a lot of hype about this too, like, oh, this is really expensive. And I mean, it isn't cheap, I guess, but anytime you're moving forward with something strategic, you've got to balance
Yep.
all those different pieces, right? So how do you help them understand that how to balance um, cost with outcomes so that that's a balanced proposition for them? And are there architectural choices that they can make as they're moving through this that can really impact that cost optimization factor as they move forward?
Yeah, and that's another great question. I'll start with the architectural piece because that's where people often struggle. It's because this was, in the past it was, let's pick a model. We have Copilot, we have whatever, we're going to use that one. And like a foundation model these days is has a very large blast radius in terms of its capability. It can do everything.
Yeah.
Most company or enterprise use cases don't need something that can do everything. It needs something that can be very targeted. So as they're
Yeah.
exploring, can this be solved with AR and AI or not? Use a foundation model. That's great. Once you've identified that that's something that's workable, then you cascade down to the size of the model that's going to work for your use case, which can include fine tuning a smaller model based on output from a larger model to get it to do what you want from a solution perspective. And there's a lot of cost
Mhm.
that you can realize based, or cost savings that you can realize based on that. And the other piece is, one of the reasons for the cloud, use serverless that only comes up, whenever you want it. Use something interruptible depending on your
Mhm.
workload. Right. So there's some basic, blocking and tackling in terms of how would you approach this. It's not just, using Gemini or using Claude, and
Mhm.
that's typically for proof of concept. You figure out how to cascade it down
Yeah.
from a cost optimization perspective. The other part of that is, what we just talked about. Are you picking the right use cases to solve that sort of lead a company forward from a capability perspective?
Mhm.
What's the X value return? Because your customers, the street, the board are going to want to see what's coming about from all of these AI experiments that a company is running, and the ability to select the most value return, especially as you start to build out
Mhm.
your foundational capability. Being able to recognize and pipeline value return is super important, and that's
Mhm.
almost a reflex that companies need to be able to develop. I would, again, based on my role, I talk to a lot of companies who are focused on cost optimization, and cost is part of it when you're getting closer to production. The more
Mhm.
important thing to figure out is, what's taking a company forward into what they're going to be in the future. And what they're going to be in the future involves solving a lot of use cases that they're not solving right now. What's the
Mhm.
value pursuit of that, right? What's the portfolio look like? Again, like I said, we work with customers and the value, like our initial backlog. So we go in and work with them. We identify a backlog. Our initial backlog, the floor is 10x. The ceiling is somewhere around 100x value return
Mhm.
for every customer that we've been working with. So it's definitely true that there are very large value returns where that would start to create the flywheel of, great, this is what we're making. This allows us to reinvest in our capability, reinvest in our AI platform, and build out, right? And then also developing those architectural motions so that you are being cost conscious about how things need to be built.
Mhm.
Part of that is understanding how what you're building is going to operate, and then you can look at how you optimize that. But there's
Mhm.
value sitting on the table, that first needs to be realized, and then figure out how to optimize the cost based on that value.
Mm. So it's almost like you're saying if you go into this with the idea that I've got a use case that I believe is going to get 10x return or 100x return, whatever it might be, that I'm going to go into that and I'll optimize cost once I understand what that return is going to be
You should
versus
understand the
I'm
cost
just
going in.
focusing.
You
Yeah.
should understand both
Yeah.
the
Okay.
cost and the value going in. So, like,
Right.
there's a team at Google called the Cloud Value Advisors.
Mm.
When you develop something in the backlog, and this is a capability that that customers who are moving the fastest develop. When you develop a capability, you also develop the practice of what's the projected value return based on this, based on total addressable market, what we think we can hit, some percent, and what our savings platform going to
Mm.
look like. So there's a team and a spreadsheet that they calculate that says this is going to return,
Mm.
5 million. This is going to return 14 million. This is going to return 3 million. Which one should you start with first, right? It is not a
Mm.
guess around, for them, it shouldn't be a guess around what they think it's going to return. Typically, we're working with the CFO and finance teams to figure out what they
Mm.
think is likely. And those are typically very, very, very conservative numbers, right? Because we don't want to say, hey, it's going to be this massive number. Conservative
Yeah.
numbers that target value, and often, like I said, once you start identifying things that are 10x, and you can still identify those things even when you're being super conservative, those are the ones to chase. And again, some of the architecture things that I talked about before get you to cost optimization quickly, but the real muscle to develop for companies who want to get to their AI driven future faster is figuring out the value return calculator as
Mm.
well as the cost optimization calculator.
That makes sense, and especially if you're going into this in a conservative mindset. So I build a strategy, I built these models that show what the use case should return and what it should cost and how it would scale, and then you can prove that out. And as you scale up, then you'll have a
Yeah,
you can refine the model, but at the same
that's
time,
right.
you would also have stop points that say, okay, well that didn't do what I thought it would do, or whatever, right? So
Exactly. And then you bail, right?
yeah.
You're exactly right. That is a super critical piece, right? How good were
Mm.
we at evaluating this? And you refine that approach just like anything else. Like I said,
Mm.
Google has a team, value advisors that do this. They've been doing this for a very long time.
Mm.
They're really good at being super accurate. And sometimes the numbers that they come up with, you're like, holy smokes, that's a
Yeah.
massive return. And that, customers are then going, oh, shoot, we didn't realize that. Yes, we want to start on that today. And before that point, it
Mm.
had all been about cost and why they couldn't. Once
Yeah.
you unlock something at a higher level, it's like, now we need to figure out how we can quickly do this, to see whether it's actually working or not, and figuring out, are we starting to
Mm.
see that value return?
Yeah. That's all. I mean, it's a much more pragmatic way to think about it, right? I'm going to go in with all this data that I know or I believe, and then if you've got a team, I mean, they must have an incredible amount of intellectual property that they use that they can bring into this to understand what are these kinds of use cases delivering versus others. Because obviously, the corpus of all that knowledge you gain as you do more and more of them is extremely valuable. Mm.
That's right. So that makes it faster, but it is doable for any team or company to do that,
Mm.
right? You can, like, if somebody wants to take a crack at it, use Gemini 2.5 Pro and say, I need to run a value exercise for this use case.
Mm.
Here's my customer base, here's what I do, here's the total addressable market, and it will help you think through that. So there are accelerators and cheats now.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, nice. Well, so one of the other, you know, I'm just curious kind of how you look at this. I mean, you're obviously working at this kind of business technology intersection and how to make what has been termed hype, but I don't agree with that. I know there's a lot of capability there, a lot of real value there. But how do you look at this? What emerging kind of technologies or architectural patterns, infrastructure that you could talk to business leaders about that you think they should be aware of, that they should be thinking about as we go forward into the future? And then This evolves really quickly, and you said that up front, right? I mean, I feel the same way. Every day I get up and I go, okay, what happened today? It's like, whoa, look at that.
Yep.
It's happening very quickly. So how do they balance staying current with betting on new capabilities or shifting as you gain new capabilities?
Yeah. There's some foundational things that are going to remain true, right? You're going to need to talk to data. You know, different agents or different systems are going to need to talk to different systems. There's got to be a human in the loop somewhere, at least looking at outcomes, even if they may not be directly, part of the process. That's going to be true regardless, right? So the building of the flexible foundation. If you think about microservices, right? Microservices were designed to be the same way.
Right.
I don't care what's running in them. I just want to be able to care and feed them, right? And you can do that at
Mm.
scale. Like Google launches like 9 billion Kubernetes containers a week, right? And is able to run and manage that. So it is, and it's because, and it doesn't care what's in there. Like when you're talking to Gemini, you're actually talking to something that's running and a Kubernetes like container. It's not exactly Kubernetes because Google's foundation is different.
Mm.
But
Right.
building that sort of thing is going to be important. What do you build from a foundational perspective? Access to data, access to being able to run in runtime, access to compute, access to an AI service, integrations with the common tools that an enterprise is going to have, monitoring and observability, to your earlier point, security,
Mm.
privacy. Those are all part of the foundation. And then it's not really, you don't really care about the technology that gets embedded in that. You just need a standard way by which that technology is getting embedded, which is, what Google's A2A framework is for and what Anthropic's
Yeah.
MVC framework is for as well. So those patterns are emerging. The real, the real kind of guidepost for organizations right now is how quickly can you build those foundations, at least enough to
Right.
start realizing value and extend those out. And how are you planning for
Mm.
that wave to flow through the rest of the technical architecture that you have to get things into the hands of your employees and your
Mm.
customers?
Mm. Yeah, that's great.
And
No, that
yeah,
that that resonates. I think the idea that you have to constantly revise the strategy as you go forward, right?
yeah, it has to be something that you can change, right? So loosely coupled, right?
Mm.
Single responsibility, all the stuff that we already know, separation, segregation,
Yeah.
observability, ethics, and XA, all that has to be built into the system.
Mhm.
And when you do that, and you're basically creating, basically messages or integrations or communication channels between things like a system and a person or an agent and another agent, the
Mm.
pipeline of communication is going to be the pipeline of communication, right? And then it's just orchestration and how you're creating each individual unit of functionality that matters.
Mm. Yeah. Well, that's a great conversation, and I really appreciate it. I learned a lot myself, and hopefully the audience did too. But that's really all the time we have today. But before I let you go, the one thing that I like to get at the end of every episode is a recommendation. Somebody, thought leader, an author, somebody that you follow or that you think that would really resonate with the audience, and it could be about AI or it could be about, I don't know, life in general, I guess too.
Yeah. So yeah, I'll give you, the one that helps, because one of the things that I see companies struggling with is what does the future look like? That's the first thing that they come and talk to Google about because they feel that we are sort of already there, which, from a all powered by AI and AI inside Google is already there. But how do they wrap their minds around what that looks like and what their future state is going to look like? So there was an article published several years ago that eventually became a book, which was called "Competing in the Age of AI." So if you want to read the original article, it's much shorter. The book itself, kind of outlines multiple use cases, but its primary point was, you know, companies that are living in the future, like Alibaba, would spawn Ant Financial, and Ant Financial is
Mhm.
now a massive banking operation. The people inside aren't necessarily running the organization. They are optimizing and building the AI that runs the organization. And that's the
Mm.
model that article proposes for the future. How do you
Interesting.
leverage, again, we talked about brain span, right? How do you leverage the brain power of your organization to help that be, sort of as optimal and powerful as possible?
Mm. I mean, that's great. That's I like to think about that even from how does management and leadership change going into the future. Managing a hybrid team versus a human team is considerably different and is going to require certain skills, different skills than we use today for management. Yeah, that's great. Well, Mike, really appreciate you joining today. Great conversation.
Yeah, it was really great. Thanks so much, Michael.
And that's the show for this week. Thank you all for joining us. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a review to help others find us. For more research on AI and other software, check out arianresearch.com. If you're an expert in AI, generative AI, or business automation, either as a provider or an end user, email your information to disambiguation@arianresearch.com. Don't forget to join us next week. Disambiguation is an Arian Research production. I'm Michael Fauscette, and this is the Disambiguation Podcast.